Welcome to a new semi-occasional video series that I'm calling Bitchspot Quickies. I'm Cephus, author of the Bitchspot blog and host of the Bitchspot Report podcast. I get a lot of questions, and while I may blog about them or include them in a podcast, that often makes the answers to commonly asked questions pretty hard to find. Who wants to listen to a 90-minute podcast to find a 5-minute answer buried somewhere in the middle? Who wants to search through hundreds of blog posts to find one or two that deal with your desired subject matter? That's why I created the Quickies, a series of videos to handle a single question in just a few minutes, allowing the curious to get in, get information, and get out in a short amount of time. No muss, no fuss. What I need from you, the viewer, are questions that you'd like me to address. These can come in the form of an email, an audio question, or a video question, whichever you prefer. Just let me know if you want to be identified or not, and I will answer your question. Bitchspot Quickies will be produced whenever I have something to say or a question to answer, so please send those questions in. Just to start things off, perhaps the most asked question I get is how I can be both an atheist, and a staunch vocal atheist at that, and a conservative. Many people are confused by the similar terms conservative and neoconservative. They assume, wrongly, that a neoconservative is just a new version of conservatism, just like the so-called new atheists are just a new form of atheism. Nothing could be further from the truth. This requires a bit of a history lesson. Set the Wayback Machine German. Back in the 1960s and 70s, Southern, traditionally liberal Democrats became disenfranchised by a Democratic Party that was becoming far too liberal for them. These were highly religious people who hated the idea of the civil rights movement and legalized abortion, two things for which the Democratic Party were becoming vocal supporters of. In the early 1970s, Richard Nixon, recognizing that the disenfranchised religious Democrats could make a powerful addition to the Republican Party, started what has become known as the Southern Strategy. At the time, the Deep South was primarily a Democratic region. Most elections were won by Democrats, right up until the early 1990s, in fact. However, many of these religious Southerners jumped ship and joined the Republican Party. By the time of Reagan, in the early 1980s, these quote-unquote Reagan Democrats held so much power in the Republican Party that they started to impact party policies and platforms. Their power over the years has only grown, to the point that today they generally steer the ship of the Republican Party. However, where they had power, their platforms were largely hyper-religious left. On social issues, they were entirely guided by the Bible, or at least their own interpretations of it. On fiscal issues, they were extremely liberal. There is nothing in the neocon platform that correlated with classical conservatism. A classical conservative believes in small government, personal and fiscal responsibility, a relative free market, and keeping the government out of the lives of its citizens as much as possible. That does not describe what neocons want. They have grown the government by leaps and bounds with each and every recent Republican presidency. They have consistently shown that the government is not capable of living within its means, and that the Republican Party wants nothing more than to tell you what you can do in your bedroom. These people are simply not conservatives, although they use the word as a means to attract conservatives who, well, let's face it, might not think very hard about the positions currently held by the Republican Party. The term is largely a holdover, a relic of a time now long past. That doesn't mean that traditional conservatives aren't still out there. I'm one of them. But unfortunately, they're just not being represented in any meaningful way in American politics today. The reasons for this are many, but they fall outside the purview of this video. Conservatism is not inherently religious, any more than liberalism is. In a nation where 85% of the population claim to hold some form of religious belief, any political party is going to have religious members and, whether we like it or not, one's beliefs, religious or otherwise, inform how we think and how we vote. The fact remains that we have a secular government, although we've certainly strayed away from the pure path. Politicians on both sides play the holier-than-thou card in order to attract voters, based not on the issues, but on their faith. This is a problem, and it has been recognized as such for a long time. One of the people who did recognize it, long, long ago, was Barry Goldwater, a Republican who was most active in the 1960s, but remained a devout advocate for real conservatism until his death in 1998. While I personally have no heroes and revere no individuals, if I had to pick from a very short list of people I highly respect, Goldwater would be towards the top of the list. Goldwater was personally religious, a lifelong Episcopalian, but recognized the danger of allowing religion to take a foothold in the Republican Party. He said in an interview in 1994, quote, "Mark my word, if and when these preachers get control of the Republican Party, and they're sure trying to do so, it's going to be a terrible damn problem. Frankly, these people frighten me. Politics and governing demand compromise, but these Christians believe that they're acting in the name of God, so they can't and won't compromise. I know. I've tried to deal with them." And of course, look what happened. Why couldn't we have listened to Barry? And then, of course, we have atheism. Atheism is simply the lack of belief in the existence of any God. It doesn't necessarily mean that you believe that gods do not exist. It is a rejection of claims made by theists about something for which they have no evidence. Let's be honest. If theists made no claims, there'd be no point to atheism at all. Atheism is a response to theism. Take away belief in imaginary friends, and atheism, like theism, would fade away. Atheism is not contradictory in any way to conservatism. In fact, I'd argue that it complements conservatism quite well. As to why I think they're so compatible, well, that's probably a subject for another time. Another thing that I am is a skeptic, and perhaps both my atheism and my conservatism spring from this fact. I want to differentiate being a skeptic from simply being skeptical. Being skeptical towards a particular subject does not necessarily translate to being skeptical of all things across the board. You can be skeptical of 9/11 truthers and still believe in Bigfoot. You can be skeptical of anti-vaxxers and still think that aliens are running the government. Being a skeptic, however, changes all of that. It requires that you turn a critical eye and an objective assessment to absolutely everything in your life. I would argue that it's simply not possible to be a skeptic and a theist at the same time. Religion cannot stand up to critical scrutiny. I do think it's important to recognize that not all atheists are, in fact, skeptics, and that a great many of them do, in fact, hold irrational beliefs which cannot be justified. One thing that is clear, most vocal atheists also self-identify as liberals. I'm sure this is something that you yourself have noticed. But why is this? I think there are three main reasons. The first is practical. Most people think that conservatism is really what the neocons believe. They just don't understand the difference, and as such, well, they don't want to be identified with the religious right wing, and they simply choose the other option, labeling themselves as liberals. I've heard from a lot of self-described liberals that that's exactly what they do. Secondly, at least in the modern era, most of the new vocal brand of atheists are young, and liberalism is quite prevalent among the young. The old saying applies. If you're not liberal when you're 25, you have no heart. If you're not conservative when you're 35, you have no brain. Unfortunately, we live in a society where having no brain isn't a major impediment. Finally, atheists tend to be quite well educated, and universities, especially these days, are a haven of liberalism. Many of the most admired atheist writers and speakers tend to also be college professors, so it's hardly surprising to find them holding a liberal bias as well. Still, there are some open, conservative atheists out there, although I've personally noticed that a lot of them tend to limit their blogging and podcasting to political and not religious matters. I'm not quite sure why this is. If there's anyone out there who can enlighten me, please do. And that finishes my first run at Bitchspot Quickies. Did this answer any questions that you had? Can you think of anything else that I could add? Is there anything else that you want to know? Send me an email, comment to the video, or link to a video of your own. Thank you, and take care.